The UN says the war in Gaza is over, but the fight against poverty and destruction continues. Israel's public broadcaster says the army opposes resuming fighting in Gaza. And US President Trump urged Ukraine and Russia to halt fighting at the battle line.
And then, of course, we have the host tonight, and I just want to thank you very much. It was a reason we chose Egypt, because you were very helpful, and very, very helpful. Everybody wanted to have this, but we really thought it was appropriate, and you are a great leader. And he's a fantastic man and a fantastic general, by the way. But he's a great president, and I want to thank Egypt and all of your representatives for treating us all so well. Thank you very much.
The United Nations Development Programme says the war in Gaza may be over, but the battle against poverty and destruction has just begun. UNDP Special Representative Jaco Celius has said that while the ceasefire offers hope, rebuilding Gaza will be an enormous challenge, with 55 million tons of debris still covering the enclave. He warned that unexploded ordnance and limited access to materials are major obstacles, adding that the war against poverty in Gaza has now begun. As the world marks the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, Gaza stands in the grip of a deepening humanitarian and economic collapse.
As the world marked the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, the Gaza Strip remained gripped by a deepening humanitarian emergency, where poverty is not an abstract target, but a daily struggle for survival. Global calls to end deprivation stand in stark contrast to conditions on the ground, where livelihoods have largely vanished and basic services are broken. Economic activity in Gaza has virtually stopped. The World Bank estimates the enclave's economy contracted by about 83% in 2024, with unemployment in Gaza near 80%, a collapse that has drained household incomes and erased job opportunities across nearly every sector. Prices have surged, further eroding purchasing power. This physical toll is vast. UN and satellite assessments indicate that well over two-thirds of structures across Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. In some areas of Gaza City, destruction surpasses 80%. Debris is estimated at about 61 million tons, complicating any recovery. Housing and essential infrastructure, water, electricity, and communications have been severely degraded, leaving communities with minimal services and unsafe shelter. The social impact is generational. More than 95% of school buildings have been damaged, with the majority requiring major reconstruction before they can reopen, interrupting education for hundreds of thousands of children. Food security is deteriorating sharply. UN analysis warned that by late September, more than 640,000 people face catastrophic levels of hunger, with the rest of the population largely in emergency or crisis phases. Agricultural losses compound the crisis. Over 80% of cropland is damaged, and access is severely restricted, while the fishing fleet has been largely destroyed. On a day dedicated to ending poverty, Gaza's reality underscores the scale of relief and reconstruction still required to restore income, services, and dignity.
convoy carrying the body of a deceased detainee returned by Hamas arrived at Israel's National Center for Forensic Medicine in Tel Aviv today morning, amid tensions over delays in the return of remains under the Gaza ceasefire deal. Israel confirmed the Red Cross handed over the body overnight, marking the 10th deceased hostage received from Gaza. Hamas said it recovered the body from beneath rubble, citing technical difficulties slowing the process. Israel insists the group already knows the location of all remaining bodies, warning that patience is running thin. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan warned that Israel may use Hamas' difficulty in recovering bodies from Gaza's rubble as a pretext to resume military operations. Speaking alongside his German counterpart Johann Wadfel, Fidan expressed concern over recent Israeli statements, calling them worrying. He added that Ankara plans to join an international task force in Gaza to monitor the implementation of the ceasefire and ensure its continuation.
Bu konuda uluslararası toplumun endişesi var. Ateşkes ortamının devam etmesi bizim birinci önceliğimiz.
Palestinian teams are conducting excavation operations in Khan Yunis, southern Gaza, to recover bodies buried beneath the rubble. The search efforts come as part of ongoing recovery operations following months of Israeli bombardment. Rescue workers say the scale of destruction has made recovery slow and dangerous, with many areas still difficult to access due to debris and unexploded ordnance. Israel public broadcaster has reported that the occupation army and security services are opposed to resuming fighting in Gaza, instead recommending non-military measures to pressure Hamas. According to the report, the Israeli army has advised the government to use alternative methods rather than force to exert pressure on Hamas. Security officials are said to be rather pushing for diplomatic and economic approaches amid growing opposition within the defense establishment to a new round of hostilities in the Gaza Strip. For more analysis, we now move to Mark Summers in our newsroom. To you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Moni. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. We're now joined from Cairo by the International Relations Specialist, Dr. Mohammed Osman. Welcome to Q News. Thank you very much for being here with us. So 10 times, Dr. Osman, what do you think might compel Israel to comply with the ceasefire agreement?
Thank you for having me, Mark. Of course, the only actor that can actually exercise any sort of pressure on Israel in order to compel it or even coerce it to comply with the provisions of the ceasefire agreement and the cessation of hostilities agreement in Gaza is the United States of America, namely the Trump administration and President Trump himself. They are the only ones capable of ensuring that Israel will comply with this agreement and that Israel will refrain from carrying out any egregious or grave violations of the current ceasefire. However, on the ground, we see that the U.S. pressure is slipping away slowly, bit by bit. As we have seen today morning, an Israeli tank shelled a vehicle transporting civilians, killing 11 people, 8 of them or 9 of them children. So we're seeing that Israel is carrying out many provocations in order to threaten the collapse of the ceasefire and make it seem as if it was an inadvertent cause that caused the collapse of the process. However, the U.S. pressure is still in place, and the Americans are still very much interested, Mark, in maintaining this ceasefire as we speak. The first phase of the agreement is all but over. All what remains is the delivery of 18 remains, or the remains of 18 hostages. And of course, the Israelis are making a fuss out of the delay, the perceived delay of the delivery of these corpses, because basically they knew very well that these corpses are buried under 50 million tons of rubble, which is the amount of destruction Israel has caused inside the Gaza Strip. Yet they do demand and pressure for the speedy and immediate delivery of these bodies, which is not possible. The Red Cross said it will take time to get most of the bodies. There were 28 bodies. Around 12 of them have been returned, and now, or 10 of them have been returned, and 18 remain under the rubble, and they are being searched for by rescue teams. However, so by the time this exchange is done, the first stage of the agreement would have been accomplished successfully, and then we move forward to phase 2, which is the hardest, of course, concerning post-war governance in Gaza and disarmament.
Yes, indeed. I mean, if Israel's leadership does reject the army's advice and uses this as an excuse and restarts hostilities further, what could we expect in the next 72 hours?
I think that Israel will most likely not undermine this agreement at this point. I do not think that the Israelis will risk risk angering the Americans or President Trump, or embarrassing the U.S. president in such a manner. I don't think that is something that they are interested in doing, at least at this very moment. The Israelis want to return the bodies, and they want to create a condition in the Gaza Strip where, without even any hostilities, the humanitarian catastrophe continues and the state of chaos prevails in Gaza, so that it would seem that reconstruction is not really possible, and that even the continued existence of the Palestinian people on their land in Gaza will not be possible either. And also, in order to provoke Hamas to carry out any sort of escalation to answer this provocation, so that they can be blamed for the collapse of the ceasefire. However, the Israelis, in my view, are not interested in seeing this agreement being implemented fully through to the end. This is something that is so distant from Israel's designs at this moment, in my view. And also, at the same time, Mark, it seems that the Israeli army is exhausted and wants to regroup and recuperate its forces once more before it can launch any further hostilities. So I think this is something that Israel will use this ceasefire to buy time in order to regroup and make new plans for potential new phases of the war, whether on the Gaza front or on other fronts.
Well, given the repeated ceasefire breaches, as you mentioned, and also movement restrictions as well, are there immediate protections that are legally required under international humanitarian law, or perhaps under the agreement?
The international humanitarian law and international human rights law completely prohibit the targeting of civilians in conflict zones and civilian targets as well. However, for over 2 years of war, Israel did not really care to respect any of these laws and has carried out what can be considered a genocide. About at least 70,000 people have perished in this war, and the actual figures might be much higher. Some are estimating that the number of deaths, fatalities in Gaza, whether direct or indirect, due to the war, may exceed 200,000 people, which is a staggering figure, and basically about 10% of the population of the Gaza Strip. So if this is not a genocide, I don't know what is. But if Israel was not willing to observe international humanitarian law in wartime, I do not see how it will be observe it or uphold it in times of ceasefire. They will always continue the transgressions because they can evade bearing the consequences, because the United States still provides them with the unlimited political cover, the means of impunity, if you will, that they can evade any accountability from, through, of course, this cover provided by the United States. So this is the unfortunate realities, and the international community and the international mechanisms stand helpless. They do not have any means by which they can impose any protections on the civilians of Gaza as things stand.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed Osman, International Relations Specialist. Thank you very much for joining us here on Q News, as always. And now back to you in the studio, Mona.
Thank you so much, Mark, for the analysis. And back to our bulletin, Israeli forces have dispersed Palestinian farmers in the West Bank village of Khubar, northwest of Ramallah, during an olive harvest dispute with settlers. Witnesses say soldiers opened fire on the farmers despite a court order allowing them to harvest their olives. The clashes come amid rising tensions across the occupied West Bank, where this year's olive picking season has been marked by repeated confrontations between Palestinians and Israeli settlers. Thousands of Yemenis gathered in Sana'a to express solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza during the Houthis' weekly demonstrations. Protesters waved Palestinian and Yemeni flags and carried photos of Houthis' military chief Mohammed Abdul Karim al-Ghamri, whose death in an Israeli airstrike was confirmed last week. The Houthis said al-Ghamri, his 13-year-old son and several senior officers were killed in the strike, but gave no further details. The group has halted attacks on Israel since the Gaza ceasefire began last week. The UN humanitarian chief, Tom Fletcher, inspected a damaged wastewater treatment plant in Gaza's Sheikh Radwan area, which ceased operations during the war. Fletcher said the UN has launched a 60-day plan to deliver 1 million meals per day and restore basic services across Gaza. He described the effort as a massive job ahead, emphasizing the urgent need to repair infrastructure and expand aid access in the devastated enclave. UN humanitarian chief Tom Fletcher visited a bakery in Deir al-Balah, Gaza, where pita bread production has resumed under the ceasefire. Fletcher said the visit shows how quickly recovery can begin when a ceasefire holds, allowing food production and essential services to restart. He reaffirmed the UN's commitment to helping Gaza rebuild and restore daily life after months of conflict and devastation. Israeli settlers escorted by military forces entered the evacuated Sanur settlement in the occupied West Bank, which Israel's far-right plans to rebuild. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich announced plans in August to restore the outpost as part of a broader settlement expansion drive. Sanur was originally evacuated in 2005 under then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon disengagement plan from Gaza and parts of the West Bank. Still ahead in our news bulletin for this hour, and violent clashes erupt in Bogota as protesters control police near the U.S. Embassy, leaving several officers injured. U.S. President Donald Trump has urged both Ukraine and Russia to halt fighting at the battle line following his meeting with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky at the White House. Speaking later in Florida, Trump said the war should stop immediately and both sides should hold their positions, warning that it's too complicated to settle otherwise. While he did not rule out supplying Ukraine with long-range Tomahawk missiles, Trump appeared focused on his upcoming meetings with Russia's Vladimir Putin in Hungary, saying he wants both parties to stop the killing and make a deal.
You go by the battle line wherever it is, otherwise it's too complicated, you'll never be able.
Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky met with U.S. President Donald Trump at the White House, saying the talks were productive and focused on security guarantees and ending the war. Zelensky said he trusts Trump's desire to bring the conflict to an end after more than 2 hours of discussions. Trump, while not ruling out supplying Tomahawk missiles, urged both sides to stop the killing and make a deal as he prepares to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin in Hungary in the coming weeks.
Questions, and so spoke about air defense. It's important for us, you know, even
Russia says its forces have struck multiple Ukrainian targets and captured 8 settlements over the past week, while Ukraine reported counter-strikes on Russian military sites in Crimea. The Russian Defense Ministry said its troops hit Ukrainian energy and transport infrastructure and downed more than 1,300 drones. Ukraine's military said it launched attacks on fuel depots, radar stations and an oil facility in Crimea, with around 80 battles taking place across 7 fronts. Violent clashes broke out near the U.S. Embassy in Bogota as protesters, some identified as indigenous, confronted police during nationwide demonstrations. Authorities said 4 police officers were injured when demonstrators hurled fireworks, explosives and arrows. Bogota's mayor condemned the criminal acts, while riot police used water cannons to disperse the crowds. The unrest came amid protests organized by the Congress of the Peoples, a movement representing indigenous and peasant communities. U.S. President Donald Trump said Spain was not loyal to NATO and should be reprimanded, renewing his criticism of allies he says are failing to meet defense spending commitments.
You pointed out Spain. They said that it's impossible.
No, Spain has not come through. No, Spain has not been loyal to NATO. Spain has been, they're the only one. Everyone went up to, as you know, I mean, you were at 2% and they all went up to 5%, but Spain disagreed with that. I think Spain should be reprimanded for that. I think it's very bad that they did that, but that's up to them. That's up to NATO and Spain.
Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has informed the UN Security Council that the resolution underpinning the 2015 nuclear deal has expired completely, blaming US and European excessive demands for undermining the accord's core purpose. In his letter to the Council, Araghchi warned that any attempt to trigger the snapback mechanism against Tehran is legally void and would damage the UN's credibility. He reaffirmed that Iran remains committed to its rights and obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, stressing that the country will continue to pursue peaceful nuclear activities in line with the international law. China has warned that the United States against what it called dangerous attempts to arm Taiwan, saying Washington would pay a heavy price for undermining its sovereignty. Defense Ministry spokesperson Zhang Zhaojiang made the remarks after the U.S. Congress passed a Defense Act allocating $1 billion to bolster military cooperation with Taiwan. Zhang said the legislation interferes in China's internal affairs and threatens global peace and stability, urging Washington to abandon what he described as its perilous Taiwan card. China's defense ministry has urged the Philippines to abandon what it called unrealistic illusions in the South China Sea after accusing Manila of illegally intrusion near the Nansha Islands. Defense spokesperson Zhang Zhaigang said Philippines vessels entered waters adjacent to Chinese islands and reefs, calling the move provocative and baseless. He warned that China will continue to take firm measures to safeguard its territorial sovereignty and maritime rights. The European Union says it is closely monitoring development in Madagascar following the military takeover and has urged dialogue to restore democratic rule in the country. In a statement, the EU called on all parties to respect constitutional order and human rights, stressing that inclusive dialogue is key to resolving the crisis. The bloc also reiterated its support for the African Union's effort to mediate and facilitate a peaceful return to civilian governance. Heavy security has been deployed in Kenya's western city of Kisumu ahead of the final public viewing of the late opposition leader Raila Odinga, after 5 people died during earlier funeral events. Military and police units, along with air surveillance, surrounded the stadium with thousands of mourners gathered overnight to pay their last respect. Odinga, a veteran politician celebrated for his fight for democracy, died in India at the age of 80. He will be laid to rest Sunday at his home in Bundo, western Kenya, following days of massive police, but rather public turnout and deadly clashes with police. A court in Abidjan has sentenced 26 opposition protesters to 36 months in prison following demonstrations over the exclusion of key candidates from the October 25th presidential elections. Hundreds of other protesters remain detained, with further hearings scheduled for October 22nd. The opposition accuses the ruling party of manipulating the election by disqualifying major challengers, deepening tensions in a country with a history of political instability. That brings us to the end of our news bulletin. But before we wrap up, here is a recap of the top stories making headlines of this hour. The UN says the war in Gaza is over, but the fight against poverty and destruction continues. Israel's public broadcaster says the army opposes resuming fighting in Gaza. And US President Trump urges Ukraine and Russia to halt fighting at the battle line. For more stories and live updates, follow Qnews on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok at QNewsEGY. From all of us here, thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates on Qnews.